In the spring of 1987, a headline in a major Washington newspaper made people pause. The aircraft of tomorrow, it suggested, would carry propellers. To many readers, raised on the romance of sleek jets and the hush of pressurized cabins that felt like being told cinema had decided to bring back silent films. Propellers belonged to a sepia-tinted past, didn't they? The idea seemed to clash with everything executives prized about the jet age. Speed as prestige, speed as status, speed as the very definition of modernity. In those boardrooms and VIP lounges, the word jet had become a talisman, and yet there it was in bold type. The future would have blades turning in the slipstream again. Across town, another writer ventured a prediction that pushed the thought even further. If a certain lightsaber-wielding hero were ever to find himself in charge of a blue-chip corporation, the correspondent mused, he would show up not in a glossy business jet, but in a turboprop. Underneath the playful image ran a genuine question. Had the great jet revolution, those silver arrows screaming across continents, already met its logical limits? Might the next great jump forward come from refining something older, quieter, and vastly more efficient? Inside NASA, at that time running a sweeping suite of energy conservation efforts in aeronautics, the question wasn't merely rhetorical. The program, known by a string of initials that sounded as compact as a wing spar, ACE, had one branch that now looked almost daring. It was called the Advanced Turboprop Project, and on paper its promise glittered. A turboprop architecture that could sip 20 to 30% less fuel than the latest turbofan engines, while still cruising comfortably, passengers unruffled, at roughly Mach 0.8 and around 30,000 feet. Those are jet-like numbers, only achieved with less burn. If you were worried about fuel prices, if you were haunted by the oil shocks and what they did to airline balance sheets, that promise was irresistible. But it was also contentious. Before the United States Senate, the candid summary put to Barry Goldwater captured the mood perfectly. Among all the proposals, the propeller, the humble, efficient propeller, was the lightning rod. The turboprop was not lonely in its boldness. Elsewhere under the ACE banner, engineers were quietly returning to a concept that had cast a spell over aerodynamicists since early in the jet century. Imagine an aeroplane whose wings seem to breathe, drawing in the thin, delicate layer of air that clings to a surface in flight, and shepherding it so gently that it never boils into turbulence. That was laminar flow control. The phrase does not sound like a revolution, but many at Langley Research Centre felt, almost viscerally, that it could be one. As early as the 1960s, a few of them had begun to murmur that this might be the true harbinger of change in the aircraft business. If you could hold the airflow over a wing in that smooth, stratified state for long stretches, the drag penalties would drop dramatically. And with drag falling away, endurance would stretch. At the very edge of daydream, there were whispers of aeroplanes that could remain aloft not for hours, but for whole days. A more grounded hope, still audacious, was a non-stop commercial run from New York to Tokyo, becoming routine. In 1963, when a research aircraft first flew with a form of this air inhalation system, one newspaper hailed it as the most promising development since the jet engine. Then the long shadow of a war fell across budgets and the momentum stalled. Yet the idea did not die. In the 1970s, it was revived into a careful, deeply practical effort, one that many at NASA quietly considered the best bet of the lot for real-world fuel savings. Two NASA centers carried these torches. Lewis Research Center oversaw the turboprop work. Langley shepherded laminar flow. The teams rarely crossed paths in the hallway, but the kinship between their ambitions was unmistakable. Each promised, if brought to maturity, a step change in efficiency, roughly 30% in the case of the advanced propeller systems, as much as 40% drag reduction for laminar flow on parts of an airframe. Achieving either would demand a cultural shift as much as a technical one. It would mean convincing a cautious airline industry to risk the unfamiliar, in form, in maintenance practice, in image. It would also require patience. These were not gadget tweaks, they were long, expensive climbs with uncertain summits. No private firm was likely to bankroll that climb on faith. Government, acting through NASA, would have to take the risk first and chart the way. The early questions then were stark and simple. Could the researchers actually deliver? And if they could, would the airlines reach out their hands and take hold? The laminar flow story in particular had a fairy gold shimmer to it, the sort that tempts people to chase year after year because the payoff is transformative if you can just do it reliably. Aerodynamicists had a phrase for it, half jest and half yearning, the pot of gold. Nothing else in the late 20th century aeronautics playbook offered quite the same potential leap in pure aerodynamic efficiency. Richard Wagner, guiding the work at Langley, could put a number on it without flinching. Among all the ACE efforts, it had the largest possible return. Keep that boundary layer sweet and laminar for long stretches, and you could see 30%, perhaps more, in fuel economy, and on the order of a quarter less drag where the technique applied. Even if you take a conservative slice of those numbers, the savings add up to figures that make an airline accountant's shoulders drop with relief. In some calculations produced decades later, trimming drag by a mere 10% and improving fuel economy by just 12% would save American carriers something like $1 billion a year. For Albert Braslow, one of the technology's most persistent champions, laminar flow control seemed like the unique key, a single technology that might one day let a transport aeroplane circle the globe without stopping, then keep going hour after hour. It was vision gilded with practicality. He also understood the metaphor hovering over it. The rainbow looks close when the sun is behind you, but as you walk, it walks. The gold never quite sits in your hand. Laminar flow, by the late 20th century, felt a little like that, over and over again, within sight, not yet consistent enough to anchor a commercial fleet. To grasp the promise and the difficulty, it helps to slow down and picture the air itself. When a slender wing or a polished fuselage pushes through the sky, it drags along a veil of air close to the surface. Engineers call that thin veil the boundary layer. Within it, two different worlds can exist. In the first, the air glides in sheets, layers that slide past one another without mixing, quiet and orderly. That is laminar flow. In the second, tiny eddies boil up within the veil, nudging and tumbling the air in restless swirls. That is turbulence. A laminar boundary layer is wonderfully gentle on drag. A turbulent one is not. At low speeds, say for a light aircraft or the frontal inches of a carefully shaped wing, laminar flow can hold on for a time with little help. But as speed rises and practical shapes meet practical surfaces, turbulence creeps forward and takes over. Airlines, flying subsonic but fast, know this penalty all too well. A huge portion of the fuel burned at cruise simply goes to shouldering aside the friction and the disorder in that thin layer. There are broadly two ways to preserve a laminar veil longer than nature would usually allow. The first is to rely on the shape itself. There are airfoil contours, subtle humps and curves, on which, under the right conditions, the flow remains laminar further back from the leading edge than on older profiles. This is sometimes called natural or passive laminar flow. It is valuable but limited, hostage to tiny surface imperfections, and to the insects and ice crystals of real life. The second method is active, laminar flow control proper. In its most promising form, the wing surface is perforated with an intricate pattern of fine holes or narrow slots, and gentle pumps draw a small amount of the boundary layer into the wing. By removing the air that would otherwise feed instabilities, the flow above can remain smooth much further aft. Seen in the mind's eye, even heard in the quiet of a wind tunnel, such a wing appears to breathe, sipping the air at its surface and exhaling it through internal ducts to the outside again. Work on these ideas is older than most people guess. In the 1930s, German researchers sharpened the mathematical tools that let engineers tell when a laminar layer is likely to break down. In 1939, Langley's engineers turned their attention to the problem in earnest, probing laminar and turbulent regimes in wind tunnels. 2 years later, they flew a massive testbed, the B-19, with 17 suction slots in a specially prepared panel on one wing. Then war forced choices. Active suction work paused in America. Efforts shifted to finding and shaping natural laminar profiles for fighter aircraft that needed speed quickly. The famous P-51 Mustang wore such a wing. In Germany and Switzerland, some active approaches continued in parallel, and when the war ended and confidential reports spilled back into the international community, Langley picked up the thread. The findings were encouraging, but so was the caution. All the careful suction in the world wouldn't help if the surface wasn't exquisitely smooth. A smear of insect residue near a leading edge, a scatter of ice, a patch of roughness after a repair, any of these could trip the boundary layer and ruin the effect. Even so, optimism swelled for a time. In the early 1960s, the Air Force sponsored significant work. In 1963 came a headline in New York that sounded the way champagne bubbles look: an aviation landmark, a milestone, flown. The aircraft in question was the X-21, a research platform derived from a bomber shape, and under the guidance of the gifted aerodynamicist Werner Fenninger at Northrop, it carried a rigorous, slotted laminar flow control system. The flights succeeded. Observers spoke with barely suppressed excitement. Perhaps this truly was the most promising advance in flight since the jet. Yet within a few years, the appetite for pushing the work further waned. Money, as always, was a current that could lift or lower a project. With resources flowing toward a distant conflict, laminar flow studies in the United States tapered off for the better part of a decade. There was, too, the cold math of the time. When jet fuel was cheap, the delicate engineering required to keep a laminar surface pristine simply didn't pay for itself on the maintenance line. History turned again. Fuel prices climbed, the war ended, and when NASA assembled its energy conservation agenda in the 1970s, laminar flow came back to the table early. Langley had never truly stopped thinking about it. In 1973, Albert Braslow quietly put forward a white paper that said without hedging that among all the possible levers, this one had the largest potential for saving fuel. Not everyone was immediately persuaded. At headquarters and even in rooms at Langley itself, some managers were cool on the idea. The barriers, they said, were too high, the practical constraints too binding. Money spent on a dream would be money gone. Yet as fuel costs kept ratcheting up, the equation shifted again. In March 1974, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics convened a meeting of nearly 100 members to weigh methods of saving fuel, and the verdict was clear. Give laminar flow the attention it deserved. A few months later, NASA's own task force echoed the sentiment. In September 1975, Edgar Courtwright, then director at Langley, formed a working group explicitly focused on the technology. Langley would take responsibility, he announced, for the development and demonstration of laminar flow control that could be built, maintained, and afforded. A quiet but meaningful change was also woven into the plan. The focus would tilt away from purely military applications toward the commercial world, where the savings, multiplied across fleets, would matter most. Within and around the program, voices were split, and it is worth lingering with both kinds, not as drama, but as the ambient sound of a profession that advances by argument as much as by calculation. The optimists could see a path with existing materials and manufacturing techniques. They were not promising magic, just careful, incremental work and the discipline to keep surfaces clean and smooth. For them, a wing in service by the 1990s did not sound fanciful. The pessimists, equally serious, said that even if the individual barriers could be cleared, the cost of maintaining a laminar surface in the real world, day after day, through weather and bird strikes and careless fueling hoses, would eat away the gains. The airline industry, never shy about naming what worries it, summarized the hazard in 4 words that covered a world of headaches: manufacturability, operational sensitivity, maintainability, methodology. In plainer terms, can we build it at scale? Will it fall out of tune the moment the weather shifts? Can we keep it in tune without bankrupting ourselves? And are we even testing and measuring it right? From the West Coast, Hans Mach, then director at Ames, added his note of skepticism. Give it low priority, he advised. The odds of success were small, and if success came, it would arrive too far in the future to help. This then was the assignment the laminar flow team accepted under AC: to gather data robust enough to move the discussion from assertion to decision. Their work would either support the hopeful claims or vindicate the doubts, but in either case it would give industry something solid: numbers, procedures, flight results on which to base the choice. There were 2 reasons to include the effort in the program despite the risk. First, if it worked, the improvement in fuel use would be dramatic, worth the attempt. Second, NASA's contemporaneous push on composite materials, strong, smooth, manufacturable, might dovetail with laminar flow needs and make production surfaces more forgiving. Albert Braslow later described the endeavour as a change not only in research focus, but in NASA's very stance. This would not be pure NACA-style research ending at the wind tunnel wall. It would extend through demonstration, proving the technology's maturity so that industry, seeing with its own eyes, might be moved to adopt it. That stance carried added exposure. It meant promising not only knowledge, but viability. It meant standing in the cold winds of politics, and in the early 1980s, those winds were brisk. The team accepted the exposure because the prize was so great. But they were not reckless. They decomposed the mountain into steps, a phased approach aligned not to a calendar, but to readiness. First, refine the analytical tools. New computer codes to predict how and where a boundary layer would turn unruly. Models to test the effectiveness of differing suction patterns. Alongside, examine surface materials and maintenance regimes. What could be polished, how damage would propagate, how to defend against insects and ice. Then in the second phase, build test pieces. Not full wings at first, but representative panels, then larger sections, all marched into wind tunnels and punished gently until the data converged. Pumps too would need attention. Quiet, reliable, with the right pressures and flows. The third phase would, only when the first 2 were sound, step into the air with actual flight testing. Laminar flow over a wing or a tailplane, instruments recording the minutes when the world stayed smooth. Braslow himself felt the pull and the caution in equal measure. The reward was almost too obvious to rehearse. What mattered was the dull daily question that decides whether a technology graduates from the laboratory to the line. can you do it not once, not in ideal weather, but again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that? As he put it, everyone could agree the payoff would be immense. The crux was whether it could be done on a day-to-day basis. If stories like this help you unwind, you're welcome to quietly subscribe to and like Space Historian so the next episode finds you when you're ready to drift off. He said, "Everybody agrees that you have a hell of a payoff, but the question is, can you do it on a day-to-day basis?" As the first two phases moved steadily forward, the work took on the calm rhythm of careful problem solving. Some of the worries had seemed almost quaint at first glance, yet they proved decisive when measured in microns. Insects, for instance, so small against a swept wing at altitude, yet large enough at the leading edge to trip the smooth layered flow into turbulence. Engineers tested rinse systems and slick surface coatings. They learned a simple truth with a practical flavour. A wet wing is a forgiving wing. Keep the surface moist at low level, and the bug splats simply will not adhere. The fragile laminar veil has a better chance to survive the climb. Noise was another spectre. Would the pressure waves rolling off modern engines disturb the delicately balanced airflow over a laminarized wing? NASA turned to Boeing and a 757 platform to characterize the acoustic environment carefully. The result was quietly reassuring. Even with the engine thunder humming through the airframe, the laminar flow did not collapse into turbulence. In parallel, the teams widened their scope beyond suction systems. Natural laminar flow, the art of choosing shapes that coax smoothness without pumps, was explored on frontline jets at Dryden, among them the F-111 and the F-14, where the combination of real weather and disciplined test flying taught lessons no tunnel alone could provide. With confidence building, the third phase took shape around a practical compromise. Airlines preferred a testbed that felt like their own aircraft, something with the presence and scale of a short-haul transport. NASA, mindful of budgets and risk, leaned toward a smaller aeroplane. The middle path was elegant. Choose a larger aircraft, but restrict the experiments to the leading edge, the most demanding place to hold laminar flow. That thin, curved front must be impossibly smooth and tough enough to shrug off rain, insects, salt, corrosion, ice, and the small abrasions of daily use. The team settled on a JetStar, a business-class workhorse not far off a DC-9 in size, and invited 3 industry heavyweights to join. Douglas, Lockheed and Boeing each took a different bite of the problem, with NASA carrying the lion's share of the cost. Lockheed's approach carried a spare beauty, a composite wing of graphite epoxy dressed with a skin of very thin titanium. Suction came through long, fine slots, driven by compressors that murmured within the wing. The arrangement worked in principle, but asked the structure to shoulder the mass of pumps, ducts and machinery. Wings must be strong and light. Adding weight is never free, and the balance here proved delicate. Douglas tried a different path. Instead of slots, they went for a quilt of tiny perforations, and they explored the use of glass fiber materials for the suction architecture beneath. Boeing arrived later to the party, having first focused their energy on nearer-term ways to cut fuel burn. But when they turned to laminar flow, they brought the methodical discipline of the transport world with them. 4 years of flying, the seasons rolling from 1983 through 1987, brought a sheaf of results that felt, at last, like proof. The leading edge stayed laminar when the air was hot and when it was cold, when rain pattered and when rain froze, in light icing, in mild bumps, even with the inevitable impact of insects. Pilots adapted easily, noting the change as a system, not a burden. The titanium did not corrode. At Ames Dryden, where the JetStar flew route-like profiles designed to mimic commercial service, a measured 22% improvement at cruise made veteran engineers quietly delighted. Roy Lang, who shepherded the laminar flow work at Lockheed, Georgia, kept a steady voice even as the graphs turned in his favor. In 1985, he said that the remaining question was not, does it work, but can it work day in, day out on an airline schedule? He could see even then a 1995 aircraft carrying the idea forward. Meanwhile, the Langley Group explored a hybrid strategy, part natural laminar flow by virtue of airfoil shape, part suction where shape alone would not suffice. Boeing adapted a 757 for this blended approach. Albert Braslow remembered the atmosphere of those tests as earnestly hopeful. Everything necessary for a truly practical hybrid system was successfully packaged inside a real transport wing. On the back of those installations, the sums for a 300-seat aircraft came out to something around a 15% fuel saving. No small number when multiplied by fleets and years. And yet, for all the bright figures, laminar flow control did not step directly into service. The proof existed. Instruments had traced the smoothness in the air, pilots had flown the profiles, but the concept had not been hardened by the relentless routine of airline operations. Then the outside world shifted. Fuel prices, which had sharpened the appetite for every litre saved, fell in the late 1980s. Without that pressure, the incentive to spend the money, time, and industrial energy needed to conquer the last stubborn hurdles softened. The technology waited, mature in parts, unfinished in others. Research did not vanish. A joint effort among NASA, Boeing, and the Air Force returned to the 757 with a refined hybrid laminar flow control system, and a Langley press note in August 1990 caught the cautious optimism. Better than expected results suggested a real step forward in aerodynamic efficiency. Engineers saw laminar flow holding across roughly 65% of the modified wing. Extend those modifications across the full span of both wings, they reasoned, and a 10% cut in drag was believable. Translated into annual returns for US carriers, the savings sketched toward $100 million. Still, the work was not done. In 2004, William Sarek and Helen Reed gathered the remaining questions into a technical diagnosis, and one phrase stood underlined: cross-flow instability. On swept wings, those subtle sideways disturbances could upset laminar flow even when surface and suction were well behaved. Richard Wagner, who had guided the program through its crucial years, expressed the feeling bluntly. It was frustrating, he said, not to see such ready technology in the field. He understood that economics would eventually turn the key. When fuel once again made the decision for everyone, laminar flow would be too attractive to ignore. And in the background, historians like James Hansen kept a longer view. Promising research ages, but it does not disappear. Sometimes it simply waits for its hour to come round again. If gentle stories about how flight gets a little smarter help you drift off, you're welcome to subscribe to and like Space Historian, so the next chapter finds you when you need it. The next wave carried a different sound, the low, swift scything of propeller tips designed for a new age. Like many of AC's efforts, the immediate history of the advanced turboprop began before AC had a name. In the early 1970s, two engineers, Daniel Michelson at NASA's Lewis Center and Carl Rohrbach at Hamilton Standard, then the country's last major propeller maker, began to compare notes. Michelson had wandered back through NACA's old wind tunnel papers and found, tucked in the plots, a slender hope that propellers could be reshaped for the jet era. Blades that were swept rather than straight, carved to control their own noise while improving their bite in fast air. Together they sketched a concept for propeller blades with aerodynamic sweep, a change that promised to hush the worst of the roar while lifting efficiency. At Lewis, Michelson's enthusiasm was catching. A small group formed around him. They solved the kind of quiet, stubborn problems that make new hardware real. They also did something engineers are not always trained to do. They became advocates. To keep a project like this alive, you had to win the confidence not only of colleagues, but of managers, manufacturers, and the public. The early circle was small, Hamilton standard on the propeller side, but as the technical case improved and the stigma of old-fashioned props began to soften, the orbit widened. Engine makers, Pratt & Whitney, Allison, General Electric, drew close. Airframers, Boeing, Lockheed, McDonnell Douglas, took seats at the table. What emerged was the kind of sprawling, energetic enterprise that historians now label big science, many contracts, many institutions, a sense of national purpose threaded through the spreadsheets. At its peak, the project touched more than 40 industrial contracts and 15 university grants, and drew on all 4 NASA research centers: Lewis, Langley, Dryden, and Ames. None of that breadth erased the controversy. The questions were both technical and social. On the technical side, internal studies at Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and Lockheed lined up 4 concerns in plain language. Could a propeller stay efficient at true transport cruise? What about the howl in the cabin and the footprint on the ground? How would the propeller interact aerodynamically with the whole aircraft once installed? And could the system be maintained without devouring the savings it created? On the social side, perception mattered. Turboprops were remembered by passengers as rattly, loud, and a little old world. The consensus, especially among marketing teams, was that nobody wanted to go back. NASA organised the work in 4 arcs. First came concept development between 1976 and 1978. Then, enabling technology from 1978 to 1980, when tools and methods were built. From 1981 to 1987 came large-scale integration, the bridging of ideas into real test articles. Finally, in 1987, flight research, the moment the designs felt the sky. Even the starting gun had a story. Of the 6 major ACE projects, the advanced turboprop alone failed to win funding in 1976. John Kleinberg, then directing Lewis, remembered the judgment: too high risk, too revolutionary for the airlines to accept. Yet outside commentary kept pointing to a pivot. Forbes in 1981 dubbed the new propeller work the next step, and inside NASA, Donald Norwood gave the sentiment a crisper phrase: the wave of the future. Winning over an industry built by then on fanjets would take patience. Executives were not reckless. They could not be. They had tied their fleet identity to the word jet, and the objections came predictably. Noise first, then maintenance, then the blunt worry about blade failures at high speed. Each had to be addressed in turn, with evidence strong enough to stand in a boardroom. Beneath the debate ran a sober reality. Airlines and manufacturers prefer to move by increments. Changing the propulsion architecture of a nation's commercial fleet is not an upgrade. It is a generational pivot. Even with hundreds of millions in government spending to lower the technical barriers, the airframe and engine houses would need to spend billions more to field and support a new product. Revolutions often arrive as a chain of careful steps. This one would be no different. There was, however, a political wind at the project's back. Across the Cold War divide, the Soviet Union had fielded a turboprop transport capable of flying from Moscow to Havana, a sign that they had found ways to squeeze real efficiency out of blades at speeds near those of jets. During the energy crisis years, such demonstrations landed with extra force in Washington. NASA presenters came to hearings with photographs of Russian turboprops to frame the choice simply: The United States could not cede technical leadership in something as strategically central as fuel efficiency in air transport. Technically, the first proof point was modest but decisive. Build a small-scale propfan and show that its measured efficiency meets the predictions. If the data aligned, the case for a larger program would be easier to make. Lewis managers placed a contract with a small joint team at Lewis and Hamilton Standard to design and test a 2-foot diameter model, the SR-1, SR for single rotating, because it carried one row of blades instead of the counter-rotating pairs that some designs favoured. The little propfan performed well, delivering the high efficiency the codes had promised. Those numbers became ammunition for the next round of funding. With that in hand, 1978 marked the formal beginning of the enabling phase. 4 difficulties stood out in the brief. First, refine the aerodynamics of the propeller itself. How much sweep? How much twist? How thick could the blades be and still behave well in fast, thin air? For the first time, engineers used computers extensively to shape propellers, a change that unlocked families of designs impossible to iterate by hand. Second, tackle noise, both in the cabin, where comfort matters, and in the community under the flight path, where regulations and good neighbourliness meet. The same computer codes that lifted efficiency also helped sculpt the blade tips and spacing to temper the most piercing tones. Third came installation aerodynamics, the art of mounting the system on the aeroplane so that propeller, nacelle and wing worked with, rather than against one another. Should the propeller pull the aircraft or push it from behind? How close to the wing should it sit? Wind tunnel work mapped the options and found placements that cut drag convincingly. Lastly, the drive system demanded attention, from shafts to reduction gears, the quiet, durable mechanics that connect turbine to blade, and the team dived into a suite of drivetrain questions, including the gearboxes. 2 years in, the low, patient work of the advanced turboprop began to glow at the edges. Interest, first polite, then purposeful, arrived from places that mattered. In Navy corridors, the Assistant Commander for Research and Technology set the idea on a short list for long-range, long-endurance missions, not as a curiosity, but as a candidate. In California, a Lockheed vice president added his voice, talking about clear performance gains for the services and a quieter, plainer promise for the public. Real energy conservation in air transport. Over at United Airlines, the Vice President for Engineering sent word in 1978 that management had reviewed the project and come away impressed. Progress so far, promise still ahead. A year later, the airline's president, Percy A. Wood, repeated the endorsement in simpler terms. This wasn't merely clever, it was important for the country and would shape the future of flying. Encouragement is a kind of fuel. With the small-scale model work complete and the industrial mood turning favourable, the team moved into the most labour-intensive stretch of all: large-scale integration. Models and wind tunnel balances had told a hopeful story, but the translation from tidy tables to hardware the size of a room is where projects live or fail. The large-scale advanced propfan effort, LAP, begun in 1980, was designed to answer the awkward questions of scale and to build a bank of data sturdy enough to design and produce full-size propfans. The first truth to land on the workbench was a humbling one. At the start, everyone had arranged the priorities in an elegant line: performance first, then noise, then finally structure. But as the calculations thickened and the parts grew heavier in the hands, it became obvious that structure came first. Without blades that could hold their shape and strength through speed and weather and time, the promised savings would stay ink on paper. Hamilton Standard took the contract to lead the structural studies, the keystone work on which the rest depended. By 1981, They were shaping a large, single-rotating prop fan, a design that would swell to a 9-foot diameter, close to a commercial size. When it rolled out 5 years later, it presented a simple logistical problem dressed as a compliment. No wind tunnel in the United States was big enough to accept it. The managers chose to accept a different sort of risk, that European colleagues might learn from what America had so carefully assembled, and shipped the SR-7L across the Atlantic to the high-speed tunnel at Modane, France. In early 1986, the model felt true air at simulated altitudes around 12,000 feet and speeds up to Mach 0.8. The numbers came back not with surprises, but with confirmation. What the small models had promised, the large model delivered. The Propfans scaled. Beyond the metal and the code was a question no slide rule could settle. Would passengers accept a visible forest of blades outside the cabin windows again? Laminar flow wings or supercritical airfoils could hide in the smooth curve of a wing and no one need think about them. A propeller lives in plain sight. For decades it had been the emblem of the puddle jumper, the short bumpy hop at low altitude, the rattle and the whine and the sense of being closer to weather than one might like. You can design a brilliant machine and still fail if the public will not step aboard. To meet the worry head-on, NASA and United Airlines took their case to the people who decide such things without ever attending a briefing. Travelers. They built an in-flight questionnaire. Everyone involved understood its stakes. A poll that suggested passengers recoiled from propellers could stall the program more surely than any failed test. The framing, then, was gentle by design. The first page carried a letter from United's Vice President of Marketing inviting help with a joint industry-government study concerning the application of new technology to future aircraft. Not a word about propellers. Only later, on the 4th page, did the propfan appear, a term chosen with care to tilt perceptions away from old and toward modern. The phrasing was quietly precise. These aircraft could fly as high, as safely, and almost as fast and smooth as jets, while using significantly less fuel. Even the illustrations were tuned to the ear of the imagination. 3 sketches, 2 propeller-driven, 1 a turbofan. All in flight, all plausible. The propellers were drawn as clean circles, no individual blades to catch the eye, while the turbofan's internal blades were visible. It was a subtle way of reminding passengers that the fan in turbofan was already familiar, already trusted. The propfan was simply a close cousin. The survey asked the essential question, which would you prefer to travel in, and waited. The answers landed like a piece of good weather. Out of 4,069 travellers, half said they would choose the propfan. 38% were neutral, and only 12% preferred a jet outright. Add a condition, no fare increase, and the preference for the propfan rose to 87%. In the debriefs, engineers allowed themselves a small smile. Most passengers, they like to point out, could not tell you exactly what was on the wing outside their window. As Dan Mickelson put it, people wanted to know 2 things first: the price of the ticket and the price of a drink. For Robert Collins, United's Vice President of Engineering, the takeaway was practical. A carefully designed propfan with comfort equal to a jet would not be viewed negatively, especially if its efficiency held the line on fares. If this kind of gentle, real-world aerospace story helps you unwind, you're welcome to subscribe to and like Space Historian, so the next episode finds you when you're ready to drift off. Progress invites company. While NASA pressed on with Allison, Pratt & Whitney and Hamilton Standard, a rival vision was taking shape in a different corner of the engine world. General Electric, Pratt's chief competitor, had been developing a distinct approach, the unducted fan, or UDF. where NASA's baseline used a single-rotation tractor prop fan at the front of the aeroplane driven through a gearbox. Gearboxes having a reputation from the Electra years for heavy maintenance, GE looked to remove the gearbox entirely. Beginning in 1982, they spent 5 years refining a gearless, counter-rotating system mounted at the rear of the airframe. 2 open fans, turning in opposite directions, would push rather than pull. In 1983, just ahead of scheduled flight tests on NASA's side, GE disclosed its unducted fan design to the agency, and the atmosphere shifted. Suddenly, there were 2 advanced propulsor families seeking the same budget and flight hours. Donald Norrid remembered the pressure candidly. There was an expectation that NASA would drop its in-house path and divert support to the newcomer. Headquarters endorsed the novelty of the UDF and instructed the Lewis team to cooperate with GE on development and testing, even as they continued their own. Results came quickly. In 1985, ground runs demonstrated about a 20% improvement in fuel consumption. The unducted fan leapt into the lead. On the 20th of August 1986, GE hung a UDF on the right wing of a Boeing 727 and flew. For NASA's engineers, there was a sting. The first advanced turboprop system to prove itself in the air was a proprietary GE engine, not the fruit of the joint NASA industry path. But competition has its own virtues. The sight of those blades turning at transport speed helped normalize the concept and built momentum for the whole idea of propeller-based high-speed efficiency. NASA, for its part, continued to mature the single-rotation system with steady discipline. The Hamilton standard SR-7A Propfan was paired with an Allison turboshaft and gearbox inside a special tilting nacelle. The team started with what pilots call fly it on a pole, a stationary test. In Chula Vista, California, at Roars Brown Field, they mounted the entire assembly on a tower and ran it in the open air. Through May and June of 1986, 50 hours of testing ticked past. The objectives were quietly met. That unlocked the final phase, the flight articles. The assembly was shipped to Savannah, Georgia, where a Gulfstream II was modified to carry an 8-blade, single-rotation prop fan on its left wing. The aeroplane bristled with more than 600 sensors to catch everything from tonal noise to minute vibrations. In 1987, it took to the Georgia sky. The figures returned were the ones that had started the journey in the early 1970s, on the order of 20 to 30% fuel savings. The press noticed. Headlines played with the symmetry of the ages, the return of the propellers, turboprops are back. Behind the easy phrases, further testing suggested that commercial development was technically within reach. As late as 1989, American manufacturers weighed new engines and airframes that might carry advanced turboprop systems into service. But markets write their own scripts. The economic world of 1987 looked nothing like the one imagined in the early energy shock years. Oil, which had cost about $3.39 a barrel in 1970, had reached around $37, 42 cents by 1980. By 1988, it had slumped to $14.87. When fuel is cheap, conservation technologies lose their brightest argument. Programs like laminar flow control and the advanced turboprop, impeccable in their engineering logic, began to look distant in cost-benefit columns. John R. Facey at NASA headquarters put the arithmetic plainly. An all-new aircraft marrying advanced avionics, structures and aerodynamics with high-speed turboprops would be more expensive than current turbofan types, and the fuel savings would not balance the higher initial price. Within the program, managers such as Keith Sievers still felt the work deserved its moment of recognition. NASA had closets of trophies for space exploration, including multiple Colliers, the annual prize that honors aviation's highest achievements. But aeronautics had gone nearly 3 decades without a winner. A Collier for the advanced turboprop would not change the market, but it would mark the accomplishment. Sievers began rallying the broad community that had contributed to the work. Headquarters hesitated at first. Should one press for a prize when the technology might not see service soon? But the season was unusual. The space side of the house was still recovering from the Challenger accident. There would be little competition for the agency's spotlight. In 1987, the National Aeronautic Association awarded the Collier Trophy to NASA Lewis and the NASA Industry Advanced Turboprop team. The roster of winners stretched across much of American aerospace. Hamilton Standard, General Electric, Lockheed, the Allison Gas Turbine Division of General Motors, Pratt and Whitney, McDonnell Douglas, Boeing. Few Collier teams had ever been larger or more varied. Even as the mainline concept paused, pieces of it kept working their way into everyday practice. The noise reduction techniques, the gearbox knowledge, the elegant fixes to keep blades dynamically stable, these moved into other programs and products. The rest of the technology found a dignified place on the shelf, archived and ready, waiting for the day when the price of fuel and the price of new hardware crossed again in a favourable way. In interviews through the mid-1990s, the engineers kept their confidence. Economics has a tide, and when it turns, Propfans would be ready to ride it. But there is a bittersweet note in careers spent building things the world is not yet quite ready to use. Donald Norwood looked back with a craftsman's affection, then closed the book gently. We almost made it,